Chapter 10 Called to Leave. As the sun was on its way down in the western sky, the caravan arrived in the outskirts of the town of Paddan-Charan. This was the northernmost town on the frontier of the land of the Amorites, and an important trading post with the regions of the north. Man, beast, and goods from all corners of the eastern world passed through Paddan. With so many people coming and going, it would be a suitable place for the house of Terah to hide from the wrath of Nimrod. The town itself was quite odd for those who were accustomed to the mud brick and stone halls of Ur. While the town center was cluttered with small tabernacles raised up on wooden posts for the use of the merchants, their houses were something else entirely. These rose distinctively out of the arid landscape, like giant beehives made from mud. Conical domes with a single opening at the roof for the circulation of air. These would be their home for the time being. As soon as they arrived on the borders of Paddan, Terah ordered his servants to begin setting up their tents. These would only be used for the first several nights, until they could find a place to build such houses for themselves as the locals did. Nothing to draw attention of any prying eyes. They had brought these with them from Ur, and were of fine goat's hair, soft to the touch, but warm enough for the cold desert nights. So the cluster of tents rose up on the outskirts of Paddan, and the house of Terah took their rest. In the days and weeks that followed, the newcomers began to settle down into their new life. A small cluster of beehive houses rose up among the others, built and funded entirely by Nahor and his servants. It was custom for the children to take care of their parents when they became old or were in distress. And while Terah was certainly old, it was the distress that he was in this time. As for Abram, he was not idle himself. As Terah was no longer captain of Nimrod's armies, they would need a new way to sustain themselves. All that Abram knew, apart from the eternal God, was shepherding. With the gold that Nimrod had given him after the incident in the fire in hand, he and Eleazar visited the marketplace and purchased sheep and long-haired goats, always in small portions, little here and a little there, so as to not arouse the suspicion of any who might be watching large sums of gold disappear into the merchant's hands in Paddan. Eleazar was most useful in these matters. Not only did he have a keen eye for the swindlers, as he would mark the actions of a servant, he also spoke the Akkadian language, which was the common tongue in the lands of the Amorites, and so served as Abram's interpreter. With these as his capital, Abram began a healthy and profitable profession as a shepherd in the fields and valleys around Paddan. His 50 years of shepherding had given him enough knowledge not only to keep the flock, but also to pass on knowledge enough for those who were with him. As his flocks grew, it became apparent that he could not take care of them all by himself. So he partitioned off a portion of the flock to Eleazar, whom he taught everything he knew about shepherding. So attentively did Eleazar learn his lessons, and so efficiently he cared to his half of the flock, that soon the 2 flocks had grown beyond the ability of 2 shepherds. Abram's solution was simple. Have the people who made themselves his servants rule over the flocks, and Eleazar would be their overseer. By day they kept the flock, sometimes going many miles far afield to find pasture in the arid climate. By night, they would sleep in tents made of goat's hair, if they were afield. The sheep and goats provided wool and mohair that was in high demand. Clothes and material for tents could be sold at the marketplace, and the milk used for food. To this end, the womenfolk of the house of Terah were not idle either. Sarai knew how to sew, as it was one of the things that maidens learned in their pastime, and she taught the older women how to sew and spin the wool fibers. Having seen the success of his uncle's enterprise, Lot took it upon himself to take up shepherding. His servants were more than willing to help him in his enterprise, as he had only 2 children, a son and a daughter, and would therefore have to work twice as hard himself than Abram did. But whereas Abram had many years of experience on his side, and so made shepherding look easy, Lot's task was much harder, as he was learning from example. Yet he applied himself, and, from learning from one of the very best, became successful himself. As such, none of the family or their servants had to go hungry or lack clothes on their backs. So the weeks became months, and the months became years. Slowly, bit by bit, the years started to roll on, one after another. Nahor's wife Milcah gave him many sons. Even Terah remarried and had sons with his young new wife. But the cloud of sorrow was upon the heart of Abram and Sarai, for they had no children of their own. Despite this, Abram had little time to brood over his sorry situation. His shepherding became so successful that many people came to him to see wherefore came such great success. To these people, Abram taught the eternal God, as he had done in Ur. Some listened, but many more merely dismissed this new God. Chief among those obstinate ones was this smug retort. You speak of so great a God, Abram, who has saved you from the fire of Nimrod and blessed you with an increase of flocks and herds. Yet he has not blessed you with any children at all. Does not your God have power over the womb to give life to his servant? Or is your God an old sterile mule like yourself? To this Abram gave them no answer, though Eliezer would angrily send them away for insulting his master so. After which Abram would chuckle and, embracing Eliezer, say to him, You are a good man, Eliezer, worth more to me than 10 sons. Abram had little to fear about his teachings as the years went on. The marketplace at Paddan was the beating heart of news activity in the region, and nothing that happened in the north, south, or west went far without being picked up in the marketplace. It was this way that Abram heard of a great defeat that Nimrod had suffered in battle. About 10 years after they had arrived at Paddan, Nimrod had gone to war with the Elamite king Chedorlaomer. He had been a member of the court of Nimrod, and had left court when work ceased on the Tower of Babel to establish a kingdom of his own on the eastern side of the Puratu River. His power was great, and he held the cities of the plain of Jordan in the land of Canaan under his sway. But when the cities of the plain rebelled against the Elamites, Nimrod saw his opportunity to strike at this king, whom he viewed as a defiant rebel. With an army of 700,000, Nimrod marched out into the desert to do battle with Chedorlaomer. Few were willing to say what happened when those two armies met, only that the Elamites routed the much larger Shinar army, and even killed Nimrod's second son, Mardon. Nimrod returned to Ur in disgrace, and in the years that followed, entered into a fragile alliance with Chedorlaomer, recognizing his sovereignty and independence. So the years passed on by, and they remained in Paddan for 23 years. It was their land now, even as Ur had been their land. Terah lived with Nahor in the little house that he built, while Abram and Lot and their servants tended their flocks. For the most part, life had been good to them. They had a measure of peace in their time, and were able to conduct business without molestation. Though life was hard, as usual, they wanted for very little here in the top of the Fertile Crescent. One night, Abram was out in the fields with the flock. He had just overseen the arrangement of the night's watch. Servants who tended the flock during the day would sleep in their tents, while the nightly watch would take over and protect the sheep and goats from lions, wolves, bears, or Amorites. As he was making one last sweep of the flock, he thought he saw a light in the mountainside, like there was a fire coming from behind the side of a cliff. With his staff in hand, the staff that Noah had given him, the staff that the Eternal had given to Adam at the fall, Abram left the flock and walked towards the source of the light. As soon as he rounded the corner, he saw a flaming apparition before him. It looked like a man, yet it was a body of brass amid a blaze of fire. The stark contrast from the dark of evening overwhelmed his senses, and Abram covered his face with his arm. Slowly the fire died, and he dared to look again. There now remained only a few small tongues of fire that illuminated the feet of the figure, which now seemed more like a human, and less like a tongue of living flame. In the flames there stood a figure clad in robes that, had Abram encountered in the streets of Paddan, he wouldn't have given him a second thought. The face was the face of a man, dark-haired, and wearing a thick beard upon his face. There was something oddly familiar about this person. He reminded Abram of what he imagined Noah looked like as a young man. "Who are you?" Abram asked.
"My name is Metatron,"
the stranger said.
"I stand in the presence of the Almighty and have been sent to you, Abram son of Terah, as his herald and spokesman."
As if stricken by a sudden fear, Abram collapsed to the ground and buried his face in the dust. He had believed in the eternal God for all his life, and though the Eternal had saved him from the fire of Nimrod, there had been no word from him in 75 years. And now, out of the blue, here was a messenger for him from the God that he served.
"Rise, Abram,"
Metatron ordered,
"and see that there be no bowing down before me. I am but a servant of the Most High God, even as you are. It is he whom you should worship."
Abram slowly rose, but he was in a state of shock and awe. The sight of the human-like being standing in the midst of the flames, unperturbed and unburned, was an awesome thing to see. Yet the intense heat and brilliance he had seen before him were still burned into his mind, as he could not force them out, no matter how hard he tried. "What message does the Eternal have for his servant?" Abram asked.
"It is time to leave, Abram,"
Metatron began.
"Get you up from among your kindred, and from your country, and from the house of your father Terah, and journey to the land I shall show you."
Abram was stunned in silence at this command. Leave? He had just begun to settle down here, to sink his roots into this land. There were people here who had begun to listen and heed the word of the Eternal. More than this, he had left the house of Noah and come to Ur to find his family. And now that he had it, he was being told to leave all that behind?
"Heed these words, Abram,"
Metatron continued.
"For the Eternal God has yet this to say to you. If my servant Abram shall obey all that I command him, and go into the land that I show him, I shall make of him a great nation and bless him, and make his name great upon the earth, and he shall be a blessing. And I shall curse them that curse him, and bless them that bless him. And through him shall all the families of the earth be blessed."
As soon as Metatron had finished speaking, the fires around his feet rose up again and enveloped his form in intense heat and brilliant fire. Abram hid his face from the fiery apparition until the light died again. Then he looked up and saw that he was alone in the darkness. The similitude of the angel had vanished. Yet his words delivered to him from the mouth of the eternal God rang in his ears. He was more than elated at having been given the great honor of hearing the words of God, the greatest honor of all, he believed it to be. Only Noah had heard words of the Eternal, as far as Abram knew, yet he was glad that the word he, Abram, now received was not one of doom and destruction of the world. Instead, he received a simple command: go forth. He made his way back to the tents and tried to fall asleep, but the memory of what he had heard was too great and profound, and all sleep was driven from his eyes. Instead, he took the night's watch over the flock, repeating the words over and over in his mind, until they were committed to memory, even as he had memorized Noah's account of the creation, the fall, the death of Abel, the debauchery of the old world, Enoch, and the deluge. He knew that he would have to share this with the others once he got back to Paddan. He was responsible for more than simply his own life, but also the lives of his servants and his wife. He had to let them in on this as soon as possible. When the morning came, Abram had one of the lower servants tend to the flocks, while he and Eleazar returned to Paddan via donkey. Eleazar led the animal, while Abram rode on its back. This beast he had purchased after a rather bountiful year of shearing and weaving, for their increase was too great to be borne on their own backs. For this very reason, he had purchased not only donkeys, but a few cattle as well, though these were harder to maintain than the sheep and goats, but they were without peer in the use of manual labor. About midday, they arrived at the stone wall that was the outer boundary of the cluster of beehive mud houses that Nahor had built for Terah and his family. Abram sent Eleazar to gather Sarai, Lot, and Lot's wife and children, and gather them together in the house for his announcement. At last, they were all gathered around the low wooden table in the central conical room. Abram sat at the head of the table, and Terah opposite him at the other end thereof. At Abram's right hand was Sarai, and Lot was at his left, with Otto at Lot's left-hand side. Eleazar stood behind Abram, near the door, awaiting his master's orders, and to Sarai's right sat Nahor and Milcah. Abram did not speak at first, as he tried desperately to gather his thoughts together before speaking out loud. It suddenly dawned on him that his family would not believe him. Why should they, when the last time he had done anything in relation to the eternal God, Haran had died? "I have something to tell you all," Abram began. "Last night, the word of the eternal God came to me. All eyes were fixed on him as soon as he said these words. Abram felt a sudden feeling of smallness and embarrassment, and a profound realization of how small he was and how poorly he would communicate to his family what he had heard and seen. "Is that so?" Lot asked. "It's a marvelous thing. In all my life I've never heard of any God that spoke back to his servants. Well, my lord uncle, what did he say? What did the Eternal say?" Abram swallowed hard, begged for help in his mind, and let the words come out slowly and carefully. "The Eternal gave me the command to leave Paddan." "And go where?" Terah asked. "To the land that he would show me," Abram replied. "You mean you don't know where he told you to go?" Nahor asked. Abram shook his head. "So what will you do, my son?" Terah asked Abram. "I will do as the Eternal tells me." Abram spoke, surprised at the suddenness of his own words. "He saved me from the fire of Nimrod and honored me with his own word. Would any of you do any less?" "Saving you from death is one thing," Nahor added. "But what further blessing has your God given you that warrants such blind obedience to him?" "One would think," Lot interjected, "that my lord's uncle's prosperity in his business is proof enough of the blessing of his God. That could be an account of his own skill as a shepherd," Nahor retorted. "Who knows what he did for 50 years in the wilderness in the north? There's no credible evidence for his God's blessing, all things considered." Sarai lowered her head and averted her eyes in shame. "The Eternal rules over all things," Abram answered. "And if I prosper as a shepherd, it is because of his blessing. As to your question, my brother, for what further blessing the Eternal has given me, he gave me a promise." "And what promise is that?" Nahor asked. "That he would make of me a great nation and bless me," Abram replied. Sarai dabbed at her eyes with her fingers, then lifted up her head and turned to Abram. "Do you believe that the Eternal will do as he promised to you, my lord?" she asked. Abram turned to her, staring into her warm brown eyes. The same tingling, overwhelming sensation filled his body when he looked into her eyes, even as it had been 25 years ago when they first met. In those eyes he saw longing and desire, not merely for him. What was her desire? Into his heart there came again the memory of what he had learned in the house of Noah, and what he had been taught about faith. This was the moment of truth, when he would once again be put to the test. Whether he was the same person at 75 as he was at 50. "Yes," he answered. Stunned silence filled the house, as each one looked up at Abram or down in shame in their own hands. "I'll go with you, my lord uncle," Lot replied. "Your God blesses you in everything you do." "Perhaps if I go with you, he will bless me too." "No," Nahor retorted. "You are mistaken, Lot. This is a foolish thing to do, especially for you." "It's only reasonable, is it not?" Lot asked in reply. "But it was Abram who was to be blessed, not you," Nahor replied. "You cannot expect to be blessed by going off with him into the desert to die. Surely you can see what this is." "And what is this, my brother?" Abram asked. "The foolish dreams of a sterile old mule," Nahor returned, turning to Abram. There was a collective gasp from Lot, Otto, and Terah. Sarai lowered her head and bit her lip. "Our late brother has Lot to bear up his name, and I have my sons, but you have no one. You made up this foolishness to ease the pain of your own impotence. But then what about what about the purpose of going out into the desert? Lot asked. To die in the desert where no one can see his shame? Nahor asked. How should I know? Be silent, Nahor, Terah retorted. You speak foolishness. We all saw Abram delivered from the fire of Nimrod. How can you doubt what he said? Because none of this means anything to me, Nahor stated. Haran is dead because of him, and we all likely would have followed him to our fathers if we went with him. He chuckled, trying to save face after he had offended his father and insulted his sister. We've made a life for ourselves here in Paddan. We have a roof over our heads. We have businesses of our own. We have families of our own. None of us have any reason to go out into the desert with Abram to die with him, he scoffed. Why, he doesn't even know where he's going. Well, my lord uncle, Lot stated, you can believe as you wish, but I believe that Abram's God blesses him in all that he does. For this, I will go with him, and my household as well. More fools still? Nahor asked. It is not foolish to follow one who is the source of great wealth, Lot stated. Nahor and Terah rolled their eyes, but Abram smiled at Lot. Someday, Lot, he said, you will come to believe in the Eternal. I have faith that you will believe in him. He then turned to his father across from him. Will you come with us, my lord? Terah sighed, lowering his eyes. My son, I am not deserving of what you have done for me all these years. I was a coward to give you up to Nimrod to save myself, and I lost my son as a result of this. I ask only for your forgiveness in this matter. Abram exclaimed, Of course, my lord father. You needn't have asked for my forgiveness, as I have already given it to you. Why would you bring this up? Because I am remaining in Paddan, Terah sighed. I am an old man, my son, much older than you. I've done my traveling and my warfare in my life. I wish to go to my fathers in peace and safety. I want there to be no ill will between you and I, my son. Abram's eyes welled up with tears. He lowered his head to hide his face, barely recognizing Sarai's hand resting upon his shoulder. May the eternal God bless you, father, for all that you have done for me, Abram muttered. No, my son, Terah said, shaking his old bald head. I have done nothing worthy of blessing. I ask for your forgiveness for the cowardly way in which I have treated you regarding Nimrod. Abram nodded, then rose up from his place and walked over to Terah. Nahor rolled his eyes, rose up and left the room, with Milcah trailing behind him. Once Abram reached the end of the table, he threw his arms around his father's shoulders, and they embraced and wept into each other's shoulders. After a moment or two of this, Abram removed himself from his father's arms and turned to Eleazar and Sarai, who hadn't spoken a word and yet remained in their seats. What about you two? He asked. There's no need to ask, my lord, Eleazar replied. I am your servant. Where you go, I will follow. You will need someone who speaks the language of the Amorites wherever you go. Abram smiled at his servant. The filial devotion of the servant resonated in Abram's heart, and mind more than Lot's desire for professional success. Here he saw someone who would be more likely to accept the eternal God out of love and devotion than his nephew. And you, Sarai? He asked, turning to the woman. Don't be foolish, my lord, Sarai returned. We've been married for 25 years. I could not so easily put you away after all you've done for me. Hardly, my love, Abram replied. Any man in the world would be fortunate to have you to wife. Even at 64, you are as radiant as fair as you were when I first laid my eyes upon you. Sarai blushed, averting her eyes once more. It is not proper to speak of a woman's age, Sarai replied. Even so, while my lord uncle is not convinced of the power of your God from all that has happened these 25 years past, yet I am. She rose from her place and walked over to Abram, resting her hand upon his chest. I will go with you, wherever the Eternal may lead you. Abram smiled, then wrapped his wife up in his arms and planted a kiss on the top of her forehead. The preparations for departure began as soon as the midday meeting was concluded. Eleazar hastily went to the other servants and told them the news. Of the 300 that had left and 23 years ago, that number had almost doubled. Many young men and women had been born, and many had been given their freedom. Only a few had died in Paddan, with the old woman from the market dying in to Nimrod's soldiers. Being the last one in the group, and caught by the red cloaks on account of the slowness of her age. But of that number, not all were willing to go with Abram. So it was that Eleazar asked that they all appear before Abram in order to address their desire whether to stay or to go. "Do not fear our master," Eleazar assured them. "He pleaded with us the appropriate number of times not to leave on his account. Surely he will not begrudge you choice in this matter." Rather than wait until evening and lose the day of preparation for their journey, Eleazar returned hastily to Abram and informed him of what his servants had said. It was with a heavy heart that the aged man gathered before his servants in front of the house of Nahor. Into his mind came again the scene of his departure from and how they had left all at a moment's notice for him. Now he would have to do without their dedicated worthy service, he feared. "My trusted servants," Abram said to them in greeting, "these past years you have served me well. By your sweat and hard labor, we have clothes upon our backs, food in our bellies, and flocks to maintain us. Surely you are all a blessing from the Eternal. In all these years have I ever been unfaithful towards you? From which adversary have I not protected you? From whose hand have I neglected to provide wages meet for their service?" "Not so, my lord," said Oni. "You and the Lord Lot have been good to us in all things. In all these years we have lacked for nothing." "My lord," another servant spoke up, "we have rendered faithful service to you in all things you have asked of us. We have not ceased to tell those who have met of the Eternal your God." "Why then," Abram asked, "do I hear word of sedition among my servants?" "No, my lord," a third servant spoke up. "It is not sedition. Eleazar is a bit overzealous in his love for you, my lord. We only wish to remain in Paddan. Many of us followed you from to Paddan, my lord, leaving all that we had behind for our love for you. Our love for you is no less than that of Eleazar, but things have changed. When we left we were the subjects of Nimrod, and all that we had was his. You offered us a chance of a different life, a better life, through the worship of your God. For this we would not be parted from you, but instead swore ourselves to your service. Now we have that different life, here in Paddan. It is not an easy life, but it is better than the one we left behind. Now you ask us to leave that life behind as well, and go you know not where? Are we to die in hunger and of thirst, or be made sport of the Amorites in the wilderness?" There was a sea of murmured agreement from some of the servants gathered in the crowd. "What would you have of me then?" Abram asked. "Give us our freedom, my lord," the servant said, "that we may remain in Paddan as our heart desires, and be not unfaithful to you at the last." More murmurs of agreement came from the other servants. At this, Abram sighed and hung his head. Then, turning to Eleazar, he asked him to bring before him his staff. The servant nodded and took off at a hasty run, then returned with the staff in his hand, which he presented to Abram, kneeling before him. The old man took up the staff and turned to his servants. "Let all those who ask for their freedom stand before me," he announced. One by one the servants approached Abram and knelt before him. It was with a heavy heart that Abram placed his right hand upon their head, declared them to be free, and bade the eternal God be with them. The day continued to wear on, and more the servants continued to stand before Abram. Eleazar began to grow impatient, but the work of packing would be held off on account of this. He had hoped that Abram would demand that they follow him. It was Eleazar's opinion that Abram was the best man in all the world, and to insult or offend him was a grievous error in his eyes. If anybody else, other than Nahor, a nobleman, and Abram's own brother, had called him a sterile old mule in his presence, Eleazar would have bludgeoned his head in there and then with his staff. So it was that, as the day wore on, the servants were dismissed one by one, until at last a little under half of their number were now freed. Only 318 remained standing where they were, among them Oni and Eleazar. Abram lifted up his eyes upon them and said, "Do you not wish for your freedom?" "My lord, you know my answer," Eleazar interjected, but Abram dismissed him with a gentle wave of his hand. His eyes were on Oni and the others. "My lord, we counted the cost when we left Ur," Oni said. "We do not wish to be parted from you, no matter what dangers await on the road ahead. You have shown us the path of righteousness, and we wish to follow." "Indeed?" Abram asked. "Are you prepared to face hunger, thirst, privation, and the dangers of the wilderness on my account yet again? Will you follow me wherever the Eternal leads me?" "As surely as the Eternal God lives, we shall," Abram said from behind. The servants gathered before Abram cried out, as one with a loud voice, "We shall." That evening the packing began in earnest. Large, thick-furred camels from the eastern regions of Shinar were their chief form of transportation, as well as the smaller dromedaries from the land of the Amorites. These had been purchased at market here at Paddan. Upon their backs were loaded many goods, mostly those belonging to the nobles of the house that were going on this great journey, namely, Abram, Sarai, Lot, Ado, and Lot's 2 children, soon to be 3 as Ado was now his child. The servants carried their belongings on their backs, or the chief servants, such as Eleazar and Oni, upon donkeys. When they had packed all that they could that was not necessary for eating or sleeping, they betook themselves to their tents and houses one last time for the evening. In the morning, ere the sun rose in the east, they betook themselves to their journey. The servants were the first to wake up, roused as usual by Eleazar. They went about packing every important thing which they would need for the journey ahead. The food they had was in the fashion of dried dates and figs, and skins of water. Sarai and Ado insisted that they bring with them their jewelry. These they had brought with them from Ur, and were their glory and wealth, and a sign of their high status. The clothing they wore, also, had changed in that time. Rather than the showy, fine apparel of Ur, they wore the simple clothing of the Amorites, floor-length robes with veiled headscarves to protect them from the desert sand and the oppressive heat. The men wore similar clothing, with lithams and keshes for protecting their heads and faces. The flocks were then gathered together to go with them. On the right-hand side of the company were the flocks of Abram, and the flocks of Lot were on the left-hand side of the company. The cattle, the most valuable animals in their herd, were the closest to the company, with the sheep and goats on the outer side. By this time, the house of Abram and Lot were now ready, and raised to leave for the long journey into the desert. Despite Eleazar's insistence that it was inappropriate to do so, Abram chose to walk instead of ride an animal. His reasoning was that he was a servant of the eternal God, and if the servants were to walk, then he chose to walk as well. Eleazar presented to him the staff, which Abram clutched in his hands for a moment, thinking back on the history of it. This staff had known work under the hand of Adam, the father of all mankind. In the hands of Canaan, Enoch, and Methuselah, it had been the scepter of a prince. It had been with him for 25 years of his wanderings. His hands were more withered and creased than they had been when he first took it up, but his strength hadn't failed him yet. As he readied himself to set out on his journey, he saw his father Terah approaching him. In his hands was a bundle of a deep blue cloth. Abram slowly approached the old man, whose face was pinched with sadness. "So much has happened because of you," he said to Abram. "Accept these as gifts of the nobility that is your birthright, as a descendant of kings." Terah presented to Abram a deep blue kesh, which he bound about his head. Terah then presented Abram with another gift, a bronze dagger with a hilt of ivory. Abram bowed low before his father in respect, and placed the dagger in his belt. Terah then wrapped his arms around the shoulder of his son and embraced him, weeping into his shoulder. "May the eternal God bless you, my son," Terah whispered. "May the eternal bless you, my lord," Abram repeated. Slowly they drew apart, and Abram turned his back on his father's house. Before him the company was ready to depart, waiting for his command. That night he had dreamed a dream where he saw Metatron standing on a hill outside Paddan, and pointing with a staff southwestward. Slowly, Abram made his way out of the front of the company, staff in hand, with the future of the world now resting upon his shoulders. Even as he made his way down to the head of the company, he saw the eyes of those around him, all looking to him for guidance. Into his mind came the doubts that the appearance of Metatron in the night had dissipated for the time being. But the words of his brother Nahor had brought back into his mind. He was going out into the desert with no clear indication of where to go. What would happen when they arrived at their destination, if they arrived at all? Would there be enough food and land for them to live? "My lord," the voice of Eleazar was heard in his ears behind him. He had arrived at the head of the company. Abram turned about to those behind him, staff in hand. A wind from the south blew upon them, sending his long gray beard waving beneath his chin. "We go forth," he said, "south by southwest." With the wind in his face and the caravan at his back, Abram began to walk. Cries were heard behind him, and the camels grunted and lowed. Then the sound of walking feet and hoofs, of ringing bells and camel saddles, and the cries of the younger servants shuffling the flocks to go this way or that, echoed behind him. The company made its way slowly but surely, away from the town of Paddan. Abram did not look back, for he knew that his doubts were lingering just behind him to draw him back, especially with the sight of his weeping father. He had set his face like flint, and would go forth, as the Eternal had commanded. The journey south would be the longest journey Abram had ever journeyed in his life so far, even longer than that he had made from the house of Noah to Ur. Their first obstacle would be the Puratu River, the western border of the land belonging to the Elamites. Beyond that, westward, was the full frontier parts of the land of the Amorites. It would be difficult to cross the river without barges, but Abram and Lot had enough funds to make such a journey possible. After a day of traveling, they pitched their tents and set night watchers upon the flocks. The tents were rather simple structures of goat's hair, soft to the touch, but warm enough to keep out the cold night air of the desert. They chose the most level ground for their camping, and the servants cleared away any large rocks and filled in any small holes they might find. First, they laid out the rugs that would serve as the floor of the tents. No sleeping on the bare earth, for fear of snakes, scorpions, or other vermin creeping into their tents at night. Then the poles were erected that gave the tents their shape. These were wooden poles fastened with rope, light of weight, and easy to be assembled and disassembled by the team of servants. The tent proper was then draped over the wooden frames, and the edges were secured to the ground with stones in a circle around the tent. So they passed the night in peace and relative quiet. When the morning came, they ate a light meal prepared for them by their maidservants, while the manservants went about taking down the tents for the journey ahead of them. By sunrise, they were ready to depart, and all their belongings were back onto the backs of their pack animals. Off on the road they continued, following in the direction that Abram was leading them. By and by they came at last to the shores of the Puratu River, and Abram sent Eleazar and Oni out to seek for ferrymen to take them to the other side. They didn't have long to wait, for they found a team of ferrymen who were willing to take them across to the western side, for a small price, of course. Eleazar did the haggling, while Abram gave his servants the orders to make ready for the crossing. They went across in small teams, sometimes with several sheep or goats on the barge with them. The loaded camels went across alone, for they were quite heavy, and any additional weight might sink the boat. Once they reached the other side, the servants took control of the animals, as the rest of the caravan made their crossing. Abram stood on the eastern shore of the river, looking out at the desert land beyond. At his side was Eleazar, gazing out with him, as the work continued. It would be slow going, and they would lose the day of travel most likely, but it could not be helped. "Is all well, Eleazar?" Abram asked. "Yes, my lord," the servant replied. "We'll be over soon enough. Once we're on the other side, though, that's another thing." Why is that? We're entering the wilderness, Eleazar began. If we don't encounter the Amorites, then the eternal God has truly kept us safe indeed. Abram nodded. We may encounter them, or we may not. Either way, the Eternal guides us. Therefore he will sustain us. He will have to, Eleazar replied. If half the things they say about the Amorites are true, they are not ones to be tangled with. What things do they say about them? Dreadful things, my lord. It is said that their chieftains regard not the laws and customs of civilized people. They do not sow or reap, nor do they build houses or towns for themselves. What they want, they take by force. It is also said that their wives are accomplished sorceresses and aid their chieftains in battle with their witchcraft. Furthermore, it is said that they are of gigantic proportions. They share this land with the Emims, a race of giants. Their kind are violent and brutish beyond belief. They fear no god, not even their own gods, and some are worshipped as gods themselves among their people. Many believe the Amorites have relations with the Emims. He turned to Abram, a worried look in his eyes. Why do you think Nimrod's army was beaten by the smaller army of the Elamites? Eleazar asked. Chedorlaomer is a master of warfare and has slain giants. Perhaps even he has giants in his armies. What then should I do? Abram asked. My lord, Eleazar exclaimed, throwing himself to his feet, it is not my place to tell my master what he should do. You follow the Eternal, and I follow you. You need not fear, Eleazar, Abram returned. I only wish to hear your mind. My lord is truly great and magnanimous beyond words, Eleazar said. Behold, if the Eternal should lead you into the land of the Amorites, then it would be wise to avoid them altogether. The fewer dealings we have with them, the better. After many long hours, they finally made the crossing of the Puratu. But they could not go very far, for they had spent a long time at the crossing, and so had little time to pitch their tents for the night. As a way of uplifting the spirits of those in the camp, for they were afield in steadily worsening wilderness with each passing mile, they would gather around the tent of Abram, young and old, men, women, and children. Together, they would listen as Abram retold the story of the creation of the world, of Adam and Eve in Eden, of the world before the flood, and of Noah and the great deluge. Day by day they continued their wandering. The arid land of Shinar was replaced by miles upon miles of barren, rocky desert. There was here neither tree nor hole under which they might quench the intense, oppressive heat of the day. They were grateful for the headdresses and veils that they wore, for they kept out the heat, and especially the sand. Those who were unfortunate enough to go on foot felt immediately the coarse, rough irritation of the pervasive sand on their feet. At times, they would see a wall of dust rise up out of the horizon, the onset of a sandstorm. From passing travelers in Paddan, they knew that these were dangerous. Those left outside in such conditions for long periods could be rendered blind or choked to death. The servants immediately dropped what they were doing and began setting up their tents to ride out the storms. These provided some protection from the storms, but of course, the sand found a way to get just about everywhere. When night came to the desert, they were very thankful for the thick tents and clothing that they wore, though it was stifling in the dry heat of the day. For without trees to block the wind, mountains though there were, they offered little protection from sun or wind. The desert nights were very cold. They huddled together for warmth inside their tents in such conditions and passed the night in hopes that the wild and remote desert would protect them from any assaults. So they made their slow journey across the northwestern arm of the deserts of Syria. But the wilderness was not without some rare charm. The wide, expansive, reddish land had a stark, savage beauty to it, such that an eye like Abram's, accustomed to the steppes of Urartu, could appreciate. The sky was more massive than one could imagine, and with days often cloudless and relatively clear, the heavens were a brilliant sapphire dome of immense size. At night, the stars shone with a brightness unfathomable, free of the light of day and the luminous clutter of the cities and towns such as Ur and Paddan. By their light and their positioning in the heavens, Abram charted their course. The wagon, whose chief star remained unmoving in the northern sky, was the chief object which he always sought, and made sure that their direction was opposite it and to the right hand. By and by, the land began to grow slightly less barren. Slowly but surely mountains began to appear on the horizon, higher than the red bluffs of the desert. Here and there, small green shrubbery began to appear, dotting the desert like a dull green carpet. Furthermore, some of the shrubs sprouted up into taller trees with thin green branches. This land, Eleazar told Abram, was the land of Lebanon, belonging to a pastoral people known as the Canaanites. Abram recognized them as descendants of the house of Ham, who had despised the covenant of Noah, and taken this land for themselves against their allotment, even as Nimrod himself. One day, they came to a place where they saw afar off a great mountain rising out of the plain. Abram longed to go up to that mountain and pray to the Eternal, asking if this was the land he had promised him. Yet that night, the message came to him to journey southward and not to remain here in the north. That morning, as the servants were busy taking down their tents, he sought out Eleazar to ask him about that mountain. Lebanon was north of his old country of Damascus, and therefore he was in the land of his nativity, and would likely know more about it than Abram did. But when Abram pointed to the mountain, Eleazar's countenance fell. "My lord," he replied, "that's no mountain. That is the temple of Baalbek." Abram gasped. "That's Baalbek? I've heard rumor of that place, but I never expected it to be so large. It can be seen for miles around." "It was built by Nimrod, so I've heard," Eleazar replied. "They say he had giants working day by day to carve stones the size of mountains for the foundations of that temple, even as he had at Babel." Abram turned to Eleazar. "Tell me what happened at Babel. I assume you were there and know firsthand what happened." "I knew very little, my lord," Eleazar began. "The core was built of massive stones, and then smaller bricks were used to cover it on the outside. The plan was to build a temple to the heavens to defy the will of the gods." "Ha!" Abram scoffed. "I'll warrant it was one god whose will they wished to defy." "And you would be right, master," Eleazar replied. "It was held in such great reverence that the bricks were held more sacred than the lives of the workers. If a man fell in his work, he was thrust into the mortar. But if a brick fell, all those about wept, and the one who dropped it was slain and thrust into the mortar. Then one day, no one could understand each other. One man spoke the Vannic tongue of Urartu, another the Akkadian tongue, another the language of the islands of Chittim, and another the tongue of Mizraim. Some said that at least 70 different languages rose up that day. There was chaos, and all folks went their own way after their own tongues." Abram nodded. "It is the doing of the eternal God. They sought to defy him, and he confounded their languages." "So it was, my lord," Eleazar nodded. "But that temple does not bode well for us. I'll wager that Nimrod built it in this land after the rebellion of the cities of the plain, to enforce his will on the lands of the south. We would not be safe here." Abram turned to Eleazar and smiled. "Last night in a dream, the Eternal revealed to me that we must continue on. And now I see why." "You're a good man, Eleazar." "I live to serve, my lord," Eleazar bowed. "You're much more to me than a servant," Abram said, placing his hand upon Eleazar's right shoulder. "You're like a son to me." "My lord," Eleazar threw himself prostrate on the ground, "I am but an ignorant dog. Who am I that my lord should look upon me with such great love?" "Please rise, Eleazar," Abram said. "You are no dog to me. You have served me faithfully these 25 years. A good and faithful servant you have been, and your knowledge of the land and the peoples therein are invaluable to me. No man could ask for a finer servant." But Abram's words had not gone unnoticed. The caravan had halted for a longer time than usual, and Lot came forward to the front of the company to see what was happening. He noticed Eleazar throwing himself down at Abram's feet, and the exchange between them. A sour expression passed over Lot's face. While he was the heir of his father's property and wealth in his own right, he was of the mind to have the wealth and property of Abram as well. After all, Abram had no son, no heir to inherit his goods. And while Nahor had been the only one of the family to outright say it, others were thinking the same as well about his peculiar condition, including Lot. It had been his hope that Abram would name him as his heir outright, and thus save him the trouble of having to work for what he considered was his rightful double portion of inheritance. So they continued on their way southward. Lebanon would be no safe place for them. They stopped by Damascus only briefly to resupply. The journey through the desert had almost completely depleted their food and water supplies. Instead of water, they had to drink goat's milk. Thankfully, the camels had made it through relatively well, and the brush and small vegetation in the less barren parts of the desert provided food enough for the sheep and goats. Only 2 cattle had died, but that was a great loss in and of itself. But the worst part of their journey was, thankfully, behind them now. The region into which they had come was of a mild climate. Though the heat of the day was oppressive and stifling as always, the land itself was much greener and less barren. The only truly troubling part was the rockiness of those parts. Deep canyons and narrow ravines split the land, providing many hiding places for outlaws and renegades. But even the sturdiest or most foolhardy of rogues would not dare attack a caravan over 300 strong. The greater danger came from the wild animals. Lions, bears, and wolves lived in these parts, and would attack the flocks at their wings. Day by day their journey continued from Damascus. The land became more and more pleasant, with mildly hot days and cold nights amidst mountainous regions of many tall trees, whether cedar, cypress, or olive, along with the low shrubs. By now the nightly visions were instructing him to go south and to leave off all westerly travel. This was well, for as they continued south, Abram sent ahead some of his swiftest servants out from the caravan on camel and donkey back as scouts to let them know if any assaults would be coming upon them. They were, of course, deep in Amorite territory, and the only ones who could protect them out here were themselves. From their reconnaissance, Abram learned something of the lay of the land of Canaan. South of Damascus there was very little in the way of civilization. Small nomadic villages of shepherds roamed here and there, moving their tabernacles with the changing feeding and watering conditions. On the western border was the Great Sea, the sea between the land. To the east there lay the Sea of Kinneret in the north, and the Jordan River flowing down from its southern shores, dividing the green land from the arid and hostile deserts far beyond to the east. The Jordan flowed down to the much larger Sea of Salt in the Wadi Sittim. Despite the name, the region was most fertile and remarkably verdant. These bodies of water, the Sea of Kinneret and the Sea of Salt, in addition to the Jordan River, served as the easternmost border of this land. But there was no resistance. On into the land of Canaan the caravan made its march. The scouts were sent out less and less frequently, for Abram believed that there would be no assault, and he had a clearer idea of where they were going. Every night the vision would come to him, and in it the angel Metatron would direct him towards the top of a hill. At the top of that hill, he would see a small town in the valley below, and beyond that, wide, verdant fields rolling downwards, dotted with many tall oak trees. It was towards this land that he was heading, and he knew that he would some day soon receive the word that this was the place where he would live. At last, after almost 3 weeks of travel, they came to the hill that Abram had seen in his vision. What had appeared to be a hill in the night vision was, in the waking world, a mountain. But it was not as rugged and difficult to ascend as the many mountains in this region, or those that Abram had walked in the land of Urartu. At the top of this mountain, Abram paused for a moment and fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. From behind, Sarai called for Eleazar to help her down off her camel. Once he had, and her feet touched the turf, the two of them rushed over to Abram's side. "My lord," Sarai said, kneeling at her husband's side, "are you hurt? What's wrong? Shall I have Eleazar bring you water?" But Abram was stunned silent, and could do no more than shake his head as he leaned upon his staff. Eleazar took hold of him and helped him to his feet, while Sarai, fearful that some malady had befallen her lord, touched her hand to his face to feel if he had come down with heat stroke. Abram made no response, but was mumbling and sobbing into his beard. At last he lifted his right hand to heaven, and cried out in a loud voice, "Praise be the eternal God, who has guided my steps through the long days of wandering, to bring me at last to this land of promise." The story continues in chapter 11.